I'm going to do is talk about what we gain by celebrating urban birds. And I'm going to talk specifically about the citizen science project that's associated with the celebration. And basically, there's a lot of things that we gain, and particularly by doing citizen science in an urban setting. As Caren had defined earlier, citizen science is engaging the public in genuine professional research. And when we do that, there's a lot of gaps that we start to fill. And I'm going to talk about 4 of these just briefly. Basically, there's gaps in science, in conservation, in community building, and in education. And I'll talk a little bit about each of those gaps and how citizen science and this project can help just work toward the first steps toward filling these gaps. And then I'm going to explain the protocol, the actual protocol for the citizen science project. Okay, so first of all, there's gaps in what we know about urban ecology. And the celebration, the citizen science project with that, is we're going to really try to understand the value of urban green spaces to birds. I'm not going to dwell on this a lot because Viviana talked about the science behind that, but I do want to emphasize that there's some research questions that really require civic participation for us to answer. And working in cities is one of those. It's really difficult for us to do without the help of the public. And just briefly, we do have big gaps in what we know about urban ecosystems. We know a lot of what Viviana talked about, well, some of it in the beginning especially, was really based on our understanding of natural systems, and we're only just starting to know more and more about how urban ecosystems work. And birds are one part of that. Okay. Another gap that we have, which was talked about a little bit earlier, is in nature conservation. And we know that contact with the wild or with nature is really an important part of having connections and building concern for nature and for nature preservation. And so there's some concerns about the fact that as more and more people live in urban areas, that there's a lot more and more people who have very little contact with nature, and so they might not have that much concern for its preservation. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's things that are kind of named now, nature deficit disorder, where kids aren't really exposed very much to the outdoors. And this has implications for the kids and for their own achievement, but it also leaves us with this question of, you know, what's the future of nature conservation if the experiences that kids have is not with the outdoors. And this is what's sort of been termed the pigeon paradox, in that all of nature conservation is might be determined by people that really have no concern for nature. And I want to go with that. Oh, because often when there is nature in urban settings, whenever nature is sort of out of place, it often seems dirty or undesirable. And so there's a need to sort of change attitudes about that. And some of the things that people are talking about is restoring ecosystems in urban settings and then improving access of urbanites to those areas. And also considering very carefully how we portray non-native species, because often that's the only connection people have. And then a second aspect I want to talk about with conservation is that our public areas and public parks aren't really enough to conserve nature. Okay, I mean, Yellowstone's not big enough. The Adirondacks aren't big enough. Central Park's not big enough. And so it's really going to be, as our population grows, we're going to rely more and more on private spaces for nature conservation. And that's, I think, one of the challenges here. And that's one of the reasons that we're focusing this project on all types of green spaces, from balconies and also to public parks, because it's all those spaces are going to make a difference, and we want to understand what kind of difference they could potentially make. Okay, another gap that we know is just in the strength of communities. And there's a lot of efforts, of course, to strengthen communities, but I think greening is one of them that's often overlooked. And there is a link between the landscapes and how green they are and human health and safety. And there's a lot of research on this topic. A lot of it's coming out of the University of Illinois. And I'm just going to review it really, really briefly because I think it's really quite interesting. And so one of the things, just to dispel myths, is that green environments actually mean less crime. A lot of times that's not what people expect. They think greening in cities often gives perpetrators a place to hide or something like that. But actually, crime is highest in areas that are most barren, and it's lowest in places that are most green. And they have a lot of psychological type studies that have found that greening actually lowers aggression. There's studies that have been done that show that green spaces entice neighbors to be outside, and so that there's more interactions on a daily basis, and actually builds stronger communities just by having those green spaces, just by having people out and meeting one another. There's been studies looking at the effects of green spaces on girls and their development that's showing that girls who are in green spaces more have less impulsive behavior and make better decisions. And then there's also several studies that have been done that kind of just show that green spaces have this effect of relieving mental fatigue. And one of them they talk about, it was done with people who are living in poverty. And under this constant strain and the stresses that are associated with living in poverty. And what they found is that exposure to green environments, I mean, obviously it doesn't alleviate their problems or the poverty that they face, but it can be very refreshing and sort of renewing mentally, and in terms of being better able to cope with the situations and with the stresses that they're facing. And then what's been in the news a lot lately is I don't know if you might have seen it, it was in the headlines, that there's a link between ADD, attention deficit disorder, and greening. And what they found is that ADD symptoms are much less when kids have more exposure to green environments. And it's not just outside time playing, because the effect was much greater even compared to paved outdoor areas, but it was really being in the green areas. And some researchers are now encouraging treating ADD with green time rather than with drugs. So there's a lot of health benefits. There's just a lot of benefits in general to green. And so I was excited that the celebration is going to focus on greening just for these other reasons, because it benefits people as well as wildlife. And then another area where we know there's gaps is in science education. And citizen science always focuses, we always have a focus on improving science literacy, and especially increasing STEM learning. And for those not familiar with the term, STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And of course, we focus on the science part. And what we know is that people, in general, what people learn is greatly influenced by how they're taught. And we know that citizen science is a great way, citizen science especially in your own neighborhood, and participating in genuine research is a great way to learn about science and to become less intimidated by science and the whole process. And I just want to find and so that's also something that's been in the news a lot. We just know that in cities, urbanites are falling behind in science. And and science literacy is something that can really help a person. Or I guess I should say not being scientifically literate can put a person at a disadvantage. And just briefly, science literacy is, when I talk about that, it's both knowledge and understanding of science concepts, but that's not really what I'm focusing on. It's not about knowing what E equals MC squares means, per se. But what I think is important is understanding the science process, because that's really what people need. It's useful tools to use even in personal decision-making, to better participate in civic and cultural affairs, and to be better off economically. And I guess just in terms of listing reasons as why it's important to be scientifically literate, I mean, for one, is just personal fulfillment. I mean, it's been something that's been satisfying to people since people started doing science. And it does strengthen everyday skills. Understanding how science works can help people know how to solve problems creatively, to think critically, can help people to know how to use technology effectively and not be intimidated by it, and have an attitude of valuing lifelong learning. It can help people achieve better jobs. And also it's really important just in empowering people to participate in discussions that our society is having about a lot of scientific issues. And there's certainly a lot of things that are going on those types of discussions. I mean, from climate change to genetic engineering and things like that. that when people are less intimidated by science, they can, and know that science is something that they can understand, they can participate in these discussions. And then also just with managing our natural resources it involves the collective judgment of all people. And so it benefits us all when everyone can participate in the discussion. So how do people become scientifically literate? So teaching about science happens in a lot of places, not just in the classroom from teachers. It's also at zoos and aquarium. Take on a big role with this in science centers, parents. Also, there's a lot of it from the news media and even from politicians, and a lot of it's not always correct. I think the media has done a lot to sort of hamper the public understanding about genetics, for one thing. And so citizen science is another way to create science literacy, and I think it's a really good one in that it's involving people in real research. Okay, so I've just briefly gone over a lot of the gaps that, when I look at it, I think, oh, that sounds really lofty. It's this, working toward filling gaps in science, in nature conservation, in community building, and in education. And what we're basically going to say is that we're going to do all of this through 10 minutes of bird watching in a green space. And so I know it sounds a little funny. And the protocol is really simple. I'm going to go over it next in detail. It's 10 simple steps. And I can tell you that if we have enough people participate in it, we're going to start at least toward answering the ecological questions and much better understand the value of urban green spaces to birds. I also hope that for at least that a lot of the people who participate will have a deeper connection with nature and have more concern for natural environments. And hopefully some of those people will also become very concerned about green spaces and have a desire to create more green spaces, both for themselves and for their communities and for wildlife. And then if it's anything like our other citizen science projects, we know that that people will be much more comfortable with science after participating in the project and have more science literacy. So in your packets, I think it's the third thing in your packet, it's sort of a template of what we're working on for the data sheet. I don't know if you can see this. So if you take that out, and so we're still working on this, and so go ahead and mark on it. We're going to want feedback from you. And basically, what we're thinking right now is that this will be printed out on a thicker, like almost postcard type of paper, and it'll fold over. You can fold yours over. It'll have an address and postage page on one side, and the back will have some kind of field guide for our focal species. And then the inside will be all the data that people collect when they participate in the project. Okay, and so I'm going to go over what the 10 steps are. And I'll also just point out that we're going to be encouraging everyone to fill these out in pen. So what these are, we call them teleforms. This is sort of what the IRS uses. So we have, these would go through a scanner, and then we have software that reads, what's it called? Character recognition. It's character recognition software. So it can actually read what people write if they fill it in the little boxes, any numbers or letters. And so what we have found, unfortunately, is that it doesn't read pencil very well. It just doesn't come out dark enough. So we encourage people to use pen. And I emphasize that because I know we all went through standardized testing, and it was like drilled into our head to use number 2 pencils on everything. And now we have to encourage people all the time with pens. So anyway, the first step will just be contact information, and we're going to try to keep that as simple as possible. And we'll have more space here in the final version than what's listed there. And the second step will be basically to know where the green space is. And and this is, in terms of people finding the green space, that's the first part of science, is just being observant and being attentive and seeing and figuring out what is green space. Because people might really only think about their parks and not realize that their balcony or their courtyard is also a green space. And there's several options as to how people can tell us where it is, and we hope people will be as precise as they can. I'll talk a little bit more about different ways people can can locate their green space in just a minute. But a street address is probably the simplest. And then people will describe the type of green space, basically categorize it. Is it a park? Is it a tree-lined street? And those can look really different. I have a couple of pictures here of one on the upper right. That's a very new street. I mean, yeah, it is. It's a very newly redone street with new trees planted, and a street that's very old with those really old trees. Or is it a traffic island, a median strip? Those are all green spaces. Could be a community garden, like the one on the right, in a vacant lot. A rooftop garden, or a yard. And then, as we've talked about, it could be a balcony garden, which is in potted plants. It could be just multiple container gardens or containers, but that's like on a stoop side. Or it really could just be a single tree or a single container. So after people pick a green space, one of those, and describe it, they'll also have to say the size. And we've just made just general categories of it being just really small, kind of medium, just a block or less, large meaning several blocks. These are kind of arbitrary, and or really quite large, something like Central Park. And then we have an option where people could add in the exact size. Like you might go to a park and it says, oh, this is 100-acre woods, and so you know exactly how big the green space is. Or for those technically minded, there's the option, Viviana showed us Google Earth, and it's a really fun tool. And it's, if you have a computer and if you have internet access or access to those things, Google Earth is free. And you can type in an address and it basically zooms in right to that address. And this is a medium-sized park in Brooklyn. And Google Earth has these tools where you can just measure the size of anything. And it also provides the latitude and longitude of any site on there. So it's a fun tool. It's a fun entryway into using different technologies. And it provides us with a really exact location if people use it. So it's good for the location and it's good for computing the size of green spaces. And then also there's a lot of municipalities that'll have public records. And more of these are on the internet. And this is in Philadelphia. They have this internet tool for looking up any parcel. And it also had a feature of measuring the sizes. And I think that's becoming more and more common. Okay, so then the next step is your position in the green space. And basically, if it's a small or medium green space, people are going to do these 10-minute watch birds for 10 minutes. And if it's a small or medium green space, they're likely they could cover the entire green space in that time. But if it's a really large green space or extra large, like Central Park, we need people to just choose a small portion that they can cover within 10 minutes. And we hope that they'll go to that site perhaps 3 times in a row. So what this means is we just want to know if they were along the edge of the green space where they did their counts or whether they were more toward the center. I hope that's straightforward. And then we ask about if there's water. And I just like some of these pictures. I get all this stuff from Google image searching, but I just thought it was funny, these big crows in that little tiny bird bath and this house sparrow shaking its head. Anyway, it cracked me up. We ask if there's water, if there's food provided for birds. So they're basically, I think they're pretty simple and straightforward, but they provide us with a lot of information. And then the last steps involve this checklist session. And so basically in the green space at a particular site, what we hope is that a person will spend 10 minutes, and from this focal list of 15 species, that they'll just mark off any species that they see in the green space in that 10 minutes. And then ideally, they would go back to that space 3 times in a week. And that would be, that, and then send in the data form. And so we have space there for people to fill in the day and the hour that they start, and just record the presence of these different species. And then number 9 is we ask how many people participated in making the checklist, like if it was a parent and a child, or if it was someone working alone. I forgot. I have that picture. It's not like a big safari, but it can still feel like one. It can still feel really exciting. It's going out to this green space with a different mindset of really being observant and attentive and appreciative of what's there. And I think citizen science can often really transform attitudes in that way because you go out with a different purpose. Anyway, and then this last question we have is really just to see if people are paying attention, and that's we ask if they want their name entered into a drawing to win a prize, which might be something like binoculars. And that's also so that people would be more inclined to give their contact information. And so that's really the whole project. And these are the focal species. And this list, we're still refining it a little bit, so it might change somewhat, but right now this is the focal species that we think we're interested in most, and these all can be found in cities. All of them span across the country, where there's two different types of orioles, in the east and the west. But they're all fairly common, and but might use very different green spaces. And so people can record the observations on this data sheet, as I said, and they can, and they can fold it, tape it or staple it, and then mail it in. Or there'll also be an option for people to then enter it on the internet. Well, it's either or. We don't want people to do both, but there'll be basically the same form on the internet. So if people would rather go online and enter the data that way, they can. So basically, that's the protocol, and it really will help us understand more about how birds use cities. We really hope that it will promote science literacy, and at least in reducing the fear and intimidation of scientists, that people have towards science and scientists. I don't think I'm intimidating. And we hope it'll increase people's conservation concerns and also increase their desire for more green spaces. And so I would like feedback on the form. I don't know if we want to do that now, or if people want